Hello, and welcome to the Victoria Forum. I'm Saul Klein, Dean of the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria and Chair of the Victoria Forum. Established in 2017, the Victoria Forum brings together change makers in the search for solutions to the pressing problems facing our people and our planet.
The Victoria Forum will bring together policymakers, business leaders, academics, youth community groups, non-governmental organizations, and Indigenous communities to generate ideas for a better world.
We are at a time right now where humanity is facing critical environmental problems. With the pandemic that we are currently facing, we are seeing a change in the climate as humanity is being forced to live a cleaner and healthier life. We have given Mother Earth a chance to heal, but we need to continue our efforts to protect and preserve her, not only for our own sakes, but for our future generations.
Our discussions are intended to be evidence-based and inclusive of different perspectives, but united by a common purpose of wanting to make a difference. As our country's chamber of sober second thought, the Senate is a perfect partner for this enterprise.
I am delighted to be part of the advisory team that is putting together the Victoria Forum, and I very much look forward to these discussions and look forward to your participation.
I hope we can all look forward to continuing the conversation and developing solutions for a better world at the University of Victoria. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Wherever you are around the world, there are many of you joining us from the 5 continents, actually 13 countries today, joining us for this truly global conversation. Soyez les bienvenus, chacun d'entre vous, où vous soyez. Et aujourd'hui, vous nous rejoignez par la magie de Zoom et de la technologie de 13 pays à travers le monde pour une conversation très importante sur l'avenir des affaires, et du secteur bancaire. Today we have a very important conversation on the future of doing business and banking, and we are looking forward to a great panel. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm Canada's ambassador to Senegal and associate co-chair of the Victoria Forum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today. Je m'appelle Sébastien Beaulieu, je suis ambassadeur du Canada au Sénégal et co-président associé du Forum de Victoria. Le Forum de Victoria, c'est un partenariat novateur entre l'Université de Victoria et le Sénat du Canada. Et ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'appeler le Sénat du Canada notre partenaire aujourd'hui. Et on a aujourd'hui comme modératrice la sénatrice Pamela Wallin. The Victoria Forum is a great partnership between the Senate of Canada and the University of Victoria, and we're very pleased to call the Senate our partner and have Senator Pamela Wallin as moderator for today's conversation. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jim DeWald, Dean of the University of Calgary Haskayne School of Business. La session d'aujourd'hui vous est présentée en partenariat avec the Haskayne School of Business et the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. So turning it over now to Mr. Jim DeWald, Dean of the University of Calgary Haskayne School of Business. Over to you and have a great time. Merci.
Thank you, Ambassador. And let me say, what a pleasure it is to co-champion this session with my good friend, Dean Saul Klein, from the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. Now, while our calendar suggests that each year starts in January, for us in education, September is clearly the start of a new year. And now is a time to move beyond planning and to take action and fulfill our goals for a new year. As we know, this year is different. The situation is new, but on the other hand, we've had now 6 months to get used to the ideas of distancing, masking, virtual connections, and so on. I'm going to suggest that with the start of this new year, we must be ready to bravely move beyond the fog of bridging, a return to normal, and accept that it is time to define our own normal. We need to move beyond playing defense and start to deliver on a playbook for how we as individuals, families, organizations, businesses, governments, and as a country overall can lead into the future. I take heart in the wisdom of Nicholas Nazim Taleb, who argues that as humans, we must use our skills to grow through adversity. He coins the term anti-fragile to indicate that we don't break, we bounce. And if we bounce well, we can move to a better place. Entrepreneurs consistently credit their success by learning through failures, mistakes, even bad luck. My wish is for people to take this opportunity to be anti-fragile and to define and implement new ways of business and banking that are more caring and thoughtful, living up to the promise of the Business Roundtable statement that says business must truly be a force for good. Now, the Victoria Forum has pulled together a diverse and engaged panel to tackle these and other questions as we explore the future of business and banking in a post-pandemic Canada. To guide our discussion, I'm so very honored to introduce Senator Pamela Wallin, an iconic member of the Senate of Canada, a well-known and beloved Canadian, and possibly the perfect moderator for this session because, as you may know, she was Canada's Consul General to New York right after the terrorist attacks of 2001. In your program on the Victoria Forum website, you will note the amazing accomplishments of Senator Wallin, including the Order of Canada, the Saskatchewan Order of Merit, 14 honorary degrees, and numerous other highly distinguished recognitions. What a tremendous honor it is for us to have her joining us today from Toronto while she's away this week on business from her home in Saskatchewan. So please join me in welcoming Senator Pamela Wallin to moderate this session. Senator Wallin.
Thanks very much, Dean DeWald. Those are very, very kind words. So thank you for your involvement in this. And I want to thank Dean Klein as well, who first reached out to me at a meeting in Regina on a very, very cold Sunday morning last January. It was a pre-COVID world, and it's hard to remember that there even was such a time. And I too look forward to continuing the Senate UVic collaboration with the Gustafson School of Business in November and going forward. I think these kinds of partnerships are very, very important. I think that the impact on our collective health has been devastating as we've gone through the COVID period. The full economic impact is still unfolding in real time, but we have already seen staggering debt and deficit numbers, and the spending continues. So we are reopening, and the economy will need, as much as people need with their health issues, a period to recuperate or recovery. But we will emerge at some point inoculated, in other words, a little bit more resilient and better able to resist further shocks and waves. And as we rebuild, we must then build in some anti-fragility strategies so we will not be so susceptible in the future. In other words, let's see if we cannot build a better mousetrap. We have already lessons learned to guide us, lessons about preparedness. Over time, did we sacrifice our capacity in a crisis and leave ourselves vulnerable in the name of efficiency and bottom lines? We witnessed many supply chains that stopped working, leaving us empty-handed, our cupboards bare. Outsourcing to countries like China left us vulnerable even on necessities such as masks and pharmaceuticals. And then, of course, we must contemplate the unintended consequences of support programs, so needed at the time, but which may prove over time a disincentive for some to return to work. So what have we learned about how governments, business, and consumers react in a crisis, and what changes must be incorporated to make us more self-sufficient? Will consumer or corporate behavior revert to old ways once the threat passes? I know just one example, yesterday, last night, being on a plane. I will want, going forward, a less crowded plane, and I will want clean air. But will I be able to pay for it? Will it even be offered? Can we really work from home for the rest of our lives, or function with kids and dogs underfoot? Or as some smart aleck suggested on Twitter the other day, what do we do with a generation of kids who have been homeschooled by day drinkers? Now, seriously, the challenges we face are very real, and it will take leadership from all of us. And I'm always reminded of the words of General David Petraeus, who commanded coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He said, in the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute vigorously. So that is our task here today, to move past the bridging and into the planning and reconstruction. Jim referred to my experience as Canadian Consul General in New York immediately post 9/11 and through the SARS crisis. Borders tightened, investment stopped, fear overtook reason. The human and economic toll was incalculable. Rebuilding trust, securing investment, kickstarting trade, it was a slow, brick by brick process. It required personal engagement, reminding everyone of our interconnectedness. And everything, and I mean everything, had a security overlay. Security trumps trade, said the US ambassador of the day. So now is it health or fear that will trump economic recovery? COVID has exposed flaws in every aspect of our economic life. We must, going forward, ensure that the generosity of spirit we witnessed in the early days of the pandemic actually infiltrates the way we engage, do business, and solve problems. Fortunately, we have some wise advisors with us today to lead us in that discussion, to help us figure out what the orders should be and how we might execute them. You have seen their complete biographies online, so let me just do a shorter version and begin by introducing Leila Karbasi, Chief of Programs at the UN Global Compact. She oversees the entire work program of the UN Global Compact on environment, social governance, and financial issues. Following Leila, you will meet Martin Rohner. He is the Executive Director, Global Alliance for Banking on Values, a network of 62 banks worldwide dedicated to inclusive and sustainable finance, serving over 30 million clients and representing over $200 billion of combined assets. And then in third place, Josh Blair, Chair of TELUS International and Vice Chair of Carebook, and a partner at Esplanade Health Tech Ventures. Josh is a global leader in the provision of business services, customer experience, digital transformation, content moderation, etc. The list is long. Carebook is a Canadian leader in providing digital healthcare solutions. And we should, of course, mention that he is a distinguished alumni of UVic. So let us go back and begin our comments today with Leila Karbasi. Leila?
Thank you very much, Senator Wallin, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Victoria Forum for having me in this very interesting panel discussion. I look forward to all the questions and the interaction with the audience. I'm calling in from New York City today, where I'm based at the headquarters of the United Nations. For those who are not familiar with the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 11,000 companies that are committed to integrating principles around human rights, labor rights, the environment, and anti-corruption into their business strategy, into their operations. And these companies come from over 160 countries around the world. So we are faced today with multiple crises, a health crisis with the current COVID pandemic, but also a social economic crisis and an emerging climate crisis, as we can see from the effects that are happening just before our eyes on extreme weather events and the wildfires in the US, in part due to the consequences of climate change. What this crisis is revealing is essentially the major inequalities in our society. Not only income inequality, inequalities around social protection, around gender and the unproportionate burden of unpaid care work being placed on women, also very structural racial injustice and inequalities. What has struck me since the beginning of the pandemic from where I sit as at the UN Global Compact is the fact that we have actually seen an increase in the number of companies that want to both participate and engage in sustainability matters. For the compact itself, we've seen an increase of 8% in our membership since the beginning of the crisis. And to me, that's a sign that long-term thinking, long-term investment, and preparedness for major disruption through investments in sustainability is gaining momentum. It's gaining momentum as a sign that corporate leaders are preparing themselves to be ready for the next possible global disruption. And there are lots of parallel to be made between this crisis, the current COVID crisis, and the climate crisis that we're in. They're both, sudden and rapid disruptions that can be caused. There are global disruptions that don't respect any boundaries or frontiers. There are disruptions that highlight the inequalities in our world that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable. And there are disruptions for which we need to have risk prevention, preparedness, resilience, so that we limit the damages that can be faced. I've worked on climate issues for over 15 years now. Briefings after briefings, we see that unfortunately we are still on a path to reach a 3-degree warming on the planet. That would lead us to uncharted territories and very dangerous effects. We have already reached some level of warming, assessed at about 1 degree. The Paris Agreement asks for all countries to engage in efforts to limit the rise of temperature to well below 2 degrees. In fact, the scientific community calls on a maximum increase in global temperature by 1.5 degrees. I sit on the board of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the initiative that helps assess the validity of targets set by the private sector to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And equal to the increased interest in participation in the Global Compact, there has been an increased interest in companies putting forward their targets to be in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. Interestingly, with the effects of COVID this year, the levels of global emissions have reduced. We are on track for 2020 to reach the target of reducing our emissions by 7%. And the main question is what will happen after, once the stimulus packages are in place, the types of investments that are going to be made, the recovery of our economy. Are we going to be able to maintain the level of CO2 reduction at the pace that is needed to stabilize our climate? And a few of our partners and ourselves are working on the theme of net zero by 2050, encouraging all companies to reach the stage of net zero emissions by 2050, which essentially means that emissions need to be reduced by 50% every 10 years. So it is a tall order. I'll just add an additional argument that study after study, we see that investments in environment, social and governance issues, in ESG issues, pay off in the long run, and companies that prioritize these issues perform better on the market and exercise higher returns, financial returns, and therefore, all these signs put together lead us to think that there is an unstoppable momentum to reach higher levels of sustainability within markets, within the private sector. I'll just finish off by saying that next week will be the 75th General Assembly of the UN. The UN is celebrating its 75th anniversary, and never before have we been in a position to actually need a place for global collaboration, for trust, for dialogue, for multilateral action. You'll hear a lot about these themes, the pillars of the UN around human rights, dignity, security, global security. And you'll hear also related to efforts on recovery and resilience quite a lot about equity for the distribution of the COVID vaccine and the need for the COVID vaccine to be seen as a public good, even though it might be developed, produced by private actors. So thanks again, and I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion.
Thanks, Leila, very much for your comments. And I think you've highlighted a couple of issues we want to discuss, the ongoing concern about inequality and how, in many senses, that has been laid bare throughout the pandemic. And also the lockdown has, and not surprisingly, reduced emissions, but should not reduce our focus on this issue. So let me turn now to Martin Rohner and ask you to begin your comments. Thanks, Martin.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Senator Wallin, and also thank you, Dean Klein, for the opportunity to be here with you today to represent the Global Alliance for Banking, on Values. Who are we? We are a practitioners network of sustainable and values-based banks. We are based in Europe, but we're really a truly global network. Senator Wallin already mentioned we have 62 members representing about 200 billion in assets, and we're really global in the sense that we're quite evenly represented in the different regions. Our network was founded in 2009, just after the financial crisis, actually also a time for rebuilding. It just reminded me when Senator Wallin mentioned 9/11, and I think since then we've gone through several of these crises in different ways. And at the time, we built our network because we wanted to make values-based banking more visible to the world and also show that there is another way of banking. Our membership is very diverse. We have credit unions, we have cooperative banks, we have retail banks, all the way to microfinance institutions in the Southern Hemisphere. But we all share the same 5 principles. First of all, we put social and environmental impact at the heart of our business model. That's really the focus. We try to really stay in the real economy rather than in the financial economy with our activities. We are very client-centered. We put the needs of our clients first and not of the banks themselves. We're resilient to crisis because we take a prudent approach to risk and to risk management. And finally, we want to also prove what we do, and by that we mean we're very transparent and we try to be accountable for what we're doing. I thought it was very interesting listening to Leila Karbasi, and I think she framed the situation quite nicely. I'm in touch with bankers really virtually around the world, from Africa to Southeast Asia, North America. And what strikes me in this pandemic is that for the first time, this is a truly global crisis that reaches really the furthest corners of this world. Everyone is affected at a very personal level. And this is happening at the same time. And I think that is really where the opportunity lies, because it has created a profound change in the way people are thinking about our economy. And people have started to challenge how things are working currently, and they're looking for new solutions. Laila Karbasi mentioned that they have a lot of companies knocking on their door to join the UN Global Compact, and I can confirm that our banks are seeing a similar phenomenon. We have a lot of banks that are reporting actually a very high increase in the numbers of clients, but also in the numbers of deposit and investments that are being placed with them. So I think that's really the big change. Now, it's too early to tell what the economic impact will be. It's too early to tell what the impact is going to be on the banks themselves, be it the general financial sector or also the members of the Global Alliance for Banking and Values. But one thing that is very clear is that banks will be playing a key role in the rebuilding of the economy. And I think that's where the Global Alliance banks come in. We feel that banks are not simply neutral brokers of capital, but that they have a responsibility of moving capital, investment, finance into the right direction, and that they have a responsibility. And that's also why we're called the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. We want to achieve positive change. And I think we have, as banks, a very huge responsibility in that respect. And we need to pass that message and make it clear also to the other banks that they will have to make sure that we're not simply rebuilding the economy as it was, but that we're rebuilding an economy that really is truly better and more sustainable, also facing, for example, the challenge of climate change. I would just, I don't want to be much long. I would maybe just like to mention one initiative which is currently really taking off and where we've been very strongly engaged. It's called the Platform Carbon Accounting Financials. And I think that initiative speaks a little bit to the frustration we've been hearing from Laila Karbasi about the slow progress at the political level and at the policy-making level on climate change. This is an example where business has taken the initiative and has decided that they want to develop a joint methodology to show what the carbon impact is of the business operations, so the investments and the loans made by banks. The goal is to make this carbon footprint of the banks transparent. And the Global Alliance members have actually even gone a step further. They have signed a commitment not only to make their carbon footprint transparent, but they're also planning to reduce that carbon footprint along the trajectory of the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's one example how business can actually really make a step forward and step up to the responsibility that it has. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over back to you, Senator Wallin.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin. It was refreshing to hear you talk about wanting to deal with the real economy. And I think that is the question: who will fund this recovery and take a chance on those who will need a hand up most? We know governments are offering short-term support, but it will be banks that are crucial to the rebuild, particularly when you put your money where your values are. So thank you very much. We'll move on now and hear some opening remarks from Josh Blair. Josh, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Wallin. You know, I would start with it's interesting that Dean DeWald commented on the need to shift from offense from defense to offense. And in that spirit, in my background is a picture of the golden goal that Sidney Crosby scored on offense back in 2010. But in all seriousness, both Dean DeWald and Senator Wallin talked about, are we going to be stuck in defense? Or as Senator Wallin said, are we going to be stuck in our old ways? Or are we going to, and businesses in particular, are we going to shift to offense, or are we going to shift to new and better ways of doing business? So I'll center my opening remarks on those comments. Also, I think both Leela and Martin did a great job of outlining the global forces that 2020 has brought to bear that will shape whether we evolve or not as citizens, as organizations, as businesses. Obviously, COVID-19 is the biggest of those, but also the reversal of globalization. In particular, the tension we see between the US and China right now, I think has implications for all countries to think through. Also, of course, the demand for social justice, social equality. And we've seen that front and center on our newspapers and our televisions, our podcasts every day over the past many months. And then finally, climate change, which is obviously an ongoing challenge, but one that seems to become more acute as the days pass. I come to you from Vancouver today, where because of the wildfires raging across the Western United States, our air quality in Vancouver, Canada is amongst the worst in the world right now. You know, I'd like to say that's a one-time event, but that's been true for the past 4 or 5 years. We've had air quality challenges as a result of wildfires, sometimes in Canada, sometimes in the US. So let me shift to what do I think we can do about it as businesses. To start with COVID-19, three things I think where we need to evolve. The first is that digital is the new queen, the new monarch that we're seeing in this time. And whether it's digital delivery of healthcare or delivering a digital experience for our customers, we have to embrace that like never before. And I would argue the digital experience in general has fast-tracked a decade over the past 6 months. And so we have to think about how we'll embrace that going forward. I would also say that the wellness of our employees as employers has taken on a whole new meaning. And yes, we provided good benefits and support and engagement and programs to our employees before, but now we really need to think through into the future. Are we providing good work from home environments? Are we providing virtual healthcare to our employees when they need? Are we constantly helping our employees with reskilling and upskilling as this digital economy fast tracks like never before? And then finally, I would say under the COVID-19 banner, our emergency preparedness has to reach whole new levels as companies and organizations. And whether that's preparing for a pandemic or preparing for a natural disaster or something else, our emergency preparedness has to reach a whole new level. Shifting to the reverse of globalization, and Senator Wallin covered this well in her comments, but I think it demands that as businesses in particular, we shift our thinking from supply chain management, which we've all done well for several years, to also include supply contingency management. So what are all the geographies that we're involved in? What are the diversity of our geographies? If we had to ramp down or ramp up in a particular geography quickly, could we? These are the sort of things I think we need to think about into the future. And then finally, putting together the demand for social justice, social equality, and also climate change. I think the call to action for businesses is to shift from our mindset and our mantra, social responsibility, to actively displaying social contribution on a regular basis. So with that, Senator, I'll turn back over to you for the discussion. Thank you.
Josh, thank you very much for that. I think that is really the point, shifting from defense to offense. I think that, and I'd like to hear from everybody on this, I think you've raised one of the core issues here, that when you talk about the reversal of globalization, our vulnerability to global supply chains, and our lack of self-sufficiency means, first and foremost, while we are still inside this pandemic, we have to be able to assure people that we've got contingencies, that we have an ability to be prepared, and that we can self-support at some point. That's a difficult thing to manage at the same time as we're still trying to fight our way out of this. But if we don't deal with the concern that people have about this pandemic, the other issues, the larger issues, will not even grasp their attention. So Martin, why don't you take a run at that?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to pick up the point that Josh Blair made with the digital economy fast forwarding by one decade, and I would even call it's almost a different process. It's the virtualization of our economy. The digitalization was already well underway, but this is like a new phenomenon because it's not just the processes which are being digitalized, it's actually suddenly the human interaction. And I think this conference is the best example for that. And it has just incredible implications if you think this through. If only about half the people that are already today staying in home office will be continuing to stay in home office. If you just think this through, what this will mean for the telecommunications industry, for the car industry, for food consumption, for example, here in Switzerland, organic food consumption is up because everyone's eating at home and the hospitality industry is crumbling. Air travel, I started my career in the very unsustainable air industry, and I cannot imagine that that air travel is going to rebound to the same levels that we've seen it in the past 5 or 10 years. So it's this tremendous change opportunity. The cards are being reshuffled, and I think this creates an opportunity for new types of businesses to come in. And I think what we really have to be careful is that these aren't just better businesses in terms of the types of solutions that they offer because they're greener, but that these are also businesses which are more resilient, if you wish, in a way, or more social in a way, because they have maybe also different type of ownership and governance. I think one of the big challenges I see today is capital markets. Capital markets decisions are being taken based on risk and return. What's happening in the real economy is not really that important. And I think that's very problematic. And so I think we need to look at new ownership and capital models, such as, or maybe actually they're old models, such as maybe cooperatives or client-owned businesses, etc., where all the stakeholders that have a stake in that company are part of the ownership. So we need to start really rethinking fundamentally how our economy is being set up. It's not just about greening the economy, but there's all these fundamental concepts that have to be resolved.
We're getting some questions here along those lines, which is in addition to governments and banks, and maybe for the first time in a long time, their interests have been merged because it's important for both sides to get back, to have the population back at work and the economy functioning. But how do you incorporate those other issues that are there, the questions of inequality that have always been there but maybe highlighted, the concerns about the climate when we're still in, can we solve these immediate health and supply issues? Leila, do you want to take a turn?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there are immediate issues to be addressed related to health, the health crisis and supply of material and information to get the crisis under control. The part that we're very interested to look into is the investments that are going to be made with the stimulus packages that are being made available for COVID. Because if these investments are locking us into high carbon technologies, we're only making the problem worse. And we will see these effects in a couple of years, perhaps in 5 to 10 years, actually relatively soon. And we know that we have a very small window of opportunity now to put our emissions path on track so that we don't have irreversible effects from climate change. And 10 years from now, if we reach our capacity in terms of emissions reduction or emissions in the atmosphere, then we may get into effects that we can no longer manage or control. So there is this immediate urge to get the current crisis under control, including the economic crisis that is unfolding and the dramatic loss of jobs around the world, and the massive inequalities in the way that we're addressing COVID. And on the other hand, for years, the negotiators under the Paris Agreement have asked for higher level of capitals to be made available for investments in green technologies and preparedness for developing countries to actually build resilient infrastructure and leapfrog, towards green technologies. And this funding has not been made available ever. And so it's very interesting to see that in light of COVID, there are trillions of dollars that have emerged for good reasons, because we need it. But it seems like our ability to predict long-term as a human race is very low, and we're only able as human beings to react to the current emergency, and somehow in our brains we have a very difficult time to integrate scientific facts and predict what is best for our own survival in the future.
But this is sort of the dilemma. I think everybody in their heart of hearts, as parents, wants to look out and say, yes, we want a safer, cleaner, greener world for the next generation and generations to follow. But I can't put food on the table if I don't have a job, and I need that job now. And worrying about whether it's a greener job than it was before kind of takes second place. So back to you, Josh, on this. We've been talking about inequality, and it's absolutely true inside countries and around. We've got, poorer countries around the world that are being doubly hit with this. But we've got a whole new kind of poverty in the sense, or inequality, because people who thought they had a job in the service sector may never have that job again. So who's in charge of reinventing these concepts?
It's really the question of our generation, isn't it, Senator Wallen? And it's a huge, challenging question. I think the only answer I could offer is that we're all in charge of it. And I don't know that anyone's going to take the absolute lead on it. And I love the quote you used, which is, in the absence of orders, come up with what you think the best possible orders would be and act on them. And I think it's incumbent upon governments, companies, organizations, the UN, citizens to think that way. And you're right, the challenge in that is we have to allow all of these entities, from individuals to organizations, to balance the short term and the long term. And that's a tough equation to solve for, but we have to permit it. And I think we just have to take our own individual action. And I can kind of give you one example. I'm working on, a multinational startup, and our goal is how can we transform education, both for adults and children, so that individuals are more equipped to work in an artificial intelligence world. And our fear is that if you forecast out 10, 20 years, a billion plus of the jobs that exist today won't exist 10 to 20 years out. So how do we prepare our population for that? And we want to try to get ahead of that. But I think you raise a brilliant question, and something that we all have to lose sleep over.
Martin, I'd like to hear from you as well. We're getting these questions in about, is this not, as Leila said, the perfect opportunity to create new ways and means for the poor to enter the economy, for us to address some of these basic issues. But then another comment saying, but how is humanity going to reach social equality if everyone is starting from a different starting point? And of course, we're talking about very poor economies and then G7 economies. Even though everybody's having the same crisis internally, it does start from a different point.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the conversation I had with a colleague from Bangladesh who said basically the government there has to decide between lives and livelihoods. So what he meant was, what's better, shutting down the economy to save lives, or is it better to keep the economy running because people really depended on a lot of informal income sources in order to live from day to day? And I think that's exactly the kind of challenge we face. I think we're very privileged in the developed countries to have all those social safety nets. And what's really shocking, and I think Leila referred to it, is to see how this progress we've been making for over the past 15 years in terms of poverty reduction and in improving also the social equality that has all been unraveled. But then again, I think it's been, I thought it was quite striking to see how quickly when push comes to shove, governments can actually react. And I think that really should make us think about that actually, if we really wanted to, change is possible. What makes me very optimistic, or more optimistic, maybe not very, but more optimistic, is to see that there's a whole younger generation that thinks differently. And again, it goes back to the values. I always say that sustainability is not really scientific issues. Science simply gives us all the data, all the information, but at the end of the day, it's a political, it's an ethical decision that has to be taken, and it's a mindset that people have. And if I see how the younger generation is focusing even their economic energy on a lot of innovative and new approaches, looking for solutions, probably because they have grown up with a totally different awareness than decision makers who are in power today. I think that's makes me more optimistic, and I do see also slowly that younger generation is rising up the ladders of the corporate world and starting to impact the corporate world in a very positive way.
Leila, back to you on these issues, and I have you comment on that, and then I want to throw in another question that's here, because from the UN perspective, that economic capital has always benefited from the high mobility of people, and I'm wondering whether that is going to shift. I mean, on the one hand, we may see more people searching and moving, searching for a better alternative. On the other hand, it's much harder to move these days, and people have kind of changed their mindset about that. How do you read that?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question. I'm sure everyone has a personal understanding of that question, and you know, I don't think there's a lot that has been done at the UN on that recently that I could draw on. So I'm just going to speak about my own personal opinion. Well, you know, just prior to the COVID crisis, I was always shocked by the amount of travel and mobility, and, you know, or people moving around, and the necessity for that. I questioned it. I questioned, you know, at the UN we travel a lot, even just that. We organize conferences, global conferences, international conferences, so many of them. 2020 was supposed to be the big year for biodiversity, with conferences in all parts of the world. And, you know, we draw thousands of people from different countries to attend those events, and I personally was not in favor of this type of approach, and I was questioning the need for being on the road so much, actually primarily because aviation, the emissions that are caused by aviation are, in large part creating climate change issues. And it's fair to question the necessity of that. Now, when it comes to traveling for, I would say, survival, or to get access to a job, or to, for other, travel that is highly justifiable, then we're in a different situation, and there needs to be a right balance. But it seemed to me that we were excessively using travel for purposes that were not justified. So in some ways, I'm feeling more relaxed now that we've put a pause button on that, and I think it should be used with caution. And in cases where it's justified and necessary for a higher purpose than just one individual.
I agree totally, and I have so many friends in all walks of life that have just said, I'm never getting on a plane to go to a meeting in Japan ever again. It's just too far. And we figured out the technology. I think, and I don't know, maybe this won't be the case, but the downside of not experiencing the rest of the world is you're less sensitive to its needs and issues. So Josh, I see you responding to that. Are you concerned?
I think, Senator, we have to approach it in balance at the end of the day, because your comments have been on. To Leela's comments, we have the opportunity to be more thoughtful in how we move forward. And, I tried to touch on that a bit in my opening comment. And that can be less travel, that can be more working from home, saving the carbon emissions associated with commuting, which are very significant. It can be paying more attention to how, as global citizens, can we play our part? For example, as TELUS focusing on how we help bridge the digital divide, which has come into attention so acutely during this time. And then that said, I think then we just need to balance it against the benefits of travel, to your point, in terms of understanding different cultures, understanding different perspectives, the benefits of bringing people together in an office environment, maybe not all the time anymore, but now and then, to build that social interaction, that social camaraderie, that brainstorming that's perhaps more difficult over a virtual format. So I think it's all about balance, and I think the real opportunity is, to me, more proactive in making sure we're thinking about things in a balanced ways. And it'd be so easy coming out of this pandemic just to go back to autopilot of our old ways and say, okay, now we're booking the company retreat here or this in-person summit there. And so I think the real opportunity is stop, check ourselves, and think about how we're thinking before we jump to action.
Martin, a couple of comments from you too on some of the questions we're getting here, and it's on that topic of, do we just revert and go back to what we knew, that do we need to refine or redefine other indicators other than our level of indebtedness and the relationship to the GDP? Do we need to redefine, and you touched on this, you all did, on the question of value? What is, it's not just the dollar value on things that we have to, the next generation, the younger generation incorporates, I think, a little bit more of that automatically in their thinking. But we also see with this technology that it is not either being fairly distributed amongst the population. It still kind of depends on your level of income.
Yes, that's true, but I'm always surprised to see how quickly that technology is actually also catching on in emerging markets, for example, and how very similar actually the strategies of our friends in the Southern Hemisphere have been in comparison to, for example, how the North American or the European banks have reacted. I think the key issue here is that we might have to have a more honest conversation and look at ourselves more, have a more critical reflection of ourselves as we go forward. What Leila mentioned was, for example, just to take that example of air travel, why have people not really, it was obvious that it was probably a little bit excessive, a bit too much, but why have people not been changing? And it's this inertia that we have to overcome, but I think part of it is also that we sometimes avoid a little bit the real discussions, the real issues. To give you an example from the banking sector, there's currently a very huge discussion going on in sustainable finance. And I think part of that is very authentic and with a true concern around the environment. But there's also that element of, well, how can we at least paint ourselves a little bit greener? Because a typical bank is operating in many different sectors. Some are destroying the environment and others are positive for the environment. Maybe they might be financing coal power plants and at the same time renewable energy. And so there might be a tendency to say, okay, let's just package the renewable energy for the clients which are looking for green products, and then we can show that we're doing something for the environment. And I think it's exactly that trap that we have to avoid when we go forward. I feel there's a lot of conversation around sustainability, and we need to be very honest how we lead that conversation and really make sure that it will have an impact, and that we're ready to face those questions. You were asking the question, for example, about internalizing certain non-financial indicators into the into GDP or also into how we do products. Absolutely, we should try to do that. It's just these issues have been on the table for so long. I'm afraid we will miss the chances. We've heard the urgency, for example, with climate change. I don't think it will be fast enough. I think one very easy way that we can progress more quickly is simply by creating transparency. For example, in the case of the banking sector, by showing what we are doing. Personally, I feel, and that's also what the Global Alliance feels, we need to, as banks, be ready to open up and show to all of our customers what is it that we're actually financing. Even though there's so many reporting requirements, they're not really accessible. That information is not really accessible to the average customer on the street. And it needs, if we will create transparency around that, I think already that in itself would create a different choice by customers, and we probably could advance much more quickly than finding the right value of, for example, education, climate change, etc.
Right. So then put it out there and say, this is what we stand for. These are our values. This is how we practice it. We're shifting from a straight on profit motive to success being in terms of climate change, reducing poverty, sustainability, all these issues. So you may not get the return that you want, but here, know that. And if you want to invest in us, then that's what it means.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to give you an example, quite a few banks in our movement, they publish every single loan because they want to show to their clients what they're doing. And I think on top of that, it's not just to have the right strategy, but also to have that element of accountability. And I'm always very wary about this connection between profitability and sustainability. There are certain sustainable actions that indeed will lead to greater resilience and profitability, and there's others that are simply going to cost money. And I'm very wary when we try to sell sustainability through a profitability lens, because it's going to be a non-starter, that we're not going to move ahead. We have to accept maybe that, yes, every business has to be profitable, but does the profit always have to be so high? Or is there a level that's enough to keep the business sustainable giving everyone, the shareholder, the co-worker, the customers, society and the environment, a fair share of the cake.
Leila, just your response to that, because I know it's not an either-or question, but if a company, if a bank, if a corporation is going to say these other things, these other values are more important to us than just straight up profits and bottom lines, we're going to take pride and credit for making a contribution to the economy or making a change in terms of even their philanthropic activities, whatever. But if you're looking for your retirement fund or to earn that money back so that you have something to pay for your kids' education, how's the individual supposed to balance that? We invest in a company because we want to make some money because we have a way to spend it. On the other hand, you know, do you think people are really ready to make the compromises on that side?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a great dilemma. And the way I like to look at it is that hopefully there's no trade-off between the investment in sustainability and the long-term returns. And you're talking about pension fund investments. These are typically investments that are there for the long run. And they're you know, there's a range of options for investments that are avoiding the worst, you know, harm to people and the planet. What's interesting is that there is a momentum on the scrutiny that is being put on non-financial both disclosure and performance and disclosure, to put it in the right order, by large asset owners and asset managers. I mean, particularly, for example, last year, BlackRock mentioned that they would screen all of their European ETFs according to the 10 principles of the Global Compact. Now, what that means in practice is, you know, not as it doesn't take it as far as what we would like to see, but the fact that there is this immense scrutiny on non-financial performance is a great start already on the side of the asset managers. The reason it doesn't take it far enough is because what it does is that it eliminates the least performers, the bottom performers, the 5% or whatever the threshold is for that asset manager from their portfolio. They would eliminate those that perform the least. The other reason why it's not ideal is that we don't have a methodology today to understand the full impact of a private operation on human rights, on labor rights, we have it on climate change to some extent, but on so many other issues related to governance, etc. It's very hard to quantify. It's very hard to compare. There's a multitude of methodologies that exist with rating agencies that are providing data to the financial sector on how corporates are performing, and depending on who is providing the data and what methodologies used, your results can be very different. So, in other words, I think to respond directly to your question about is there a trade-off, I think today there are many sort of business models that exist that are both profitable and good for people and the planet. And it is a political decision to put the incentives in place so that investments flow towards those types of businesses, those types of technologies. And it is a difficult decision because there is a transition, and it's very hard to manage that transition and that shift. But I want to think of it as something that doesn't bring that clear trade-off
All right, I want to come back and ask you all, because I'm getting a series of questions coming in here, and I'm trying to collate them as best I can, but they want to go, there's questions, they want to go back to the issue of capital mobility versus human mobility, and that, of course, capital can make these decisions whenever they want and decide to go and invest in a country where the rules are easier and they can do what they will. Not so easy for human capital to move, as we were discussing earlier. But is there, in your minds, an undue influence still today on the part of the capital markets or the finance sector in general? Do you really think that because of our focus on economic matters, that they drive the political agenda too directly? Josh?
I think the honest answer is yes. And so I think, how do you, the question then becomes, how do you go about changing that over time? And I see it as a three-tier challenge and solution ahead of us. There is, I think Martin and Leila both covered this to some degree quite beautifully. There is a role for government, and that goes all the way to the laws of the land. And by way of example, in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that a corporation has to balance the needs of all its stakeholders. In many other countries, the Supreme Court of the land has ruled that corporations have to put the shareholder first above other stakeholders. That's the law. And so, I think that starts at the highest levels of government, how to think through it. I think the second of the three levels is the corporation or the organization itself. I don't want to just limit this to corporations. All organizations have a role to play in being more balanced, more sustainable in their approach. And I love how Martin talked about it really comes down to transparency of those organizations, and do they believe in where the world is headed, and that more transparency and more balance is required. And you can look at organizations and see, do they publish targets, not just on their financials, but do they publish targets on other environmental, social, and governance aspects? And I think that's an important thing for any investor or consumer to look at. And you've got companies like us that have been part of the UN Global Compact for 10 plus years. But then finally, I think the biggest change will come over time, and I think this is going to take time, when the consumer starts voting with their wallet. And you touched on this, Senator, in the sense when consumers truly start thinking about, where do I spend my money, where do I invest my money, where am I willing to work? And once that becomes more of a mass movement versus what I would call it today an early movement, I think then you'll see behaviors of companies, organizations follow suit.
To you, Martin, I'll let you press the necessary buttons. We're getting questions that are large and small, very focused. Any advice for small businesses, many of whom are struggling frantically, how they can become more resilient? It's easy when you think of a large corporation that they can change supply lines and purchasing strategies. But if you're the corner store, mom and pop, that's a very different thing. And then Leila, I'll come to you on the following question so you can be thinking about it. Can we see more global cooperation, not just on things like inventing a vaccine where people are working cross borders with great ease, but can that become larger when we consider public issues, public policy? Is that even reasonable in the world we're living in now? So Martin, first to you on the question of small business.
Yeah, I think probably a small business owner knows his business much better than I would. And so who would I be to provide some advice? I think if anything, first of all, what matters is that you try to seize the opportunity of the moment to look for innovative solutions that give you an edge over other businesses, I guess, and that you have businesses that are not so easy copyable. In terms of your bank, I recommend that you work with a bank where you really feel that they have best intentions and have your prosperity and your evolution in mind, rather than of primarily making a big buck on providing a loan.
That's
and I think that's really important.
Hard time having that relationship.
Yeah. Sorry.
That small business has a more difficult time having a relationship with a bank. It's almost those who don't need the money get the money, and a small business, an economic crunch, it's very difficult. They're high risk.
And luckily, that's why there are increasingly, not just, I think really increasingly around the globe, banks like those that are members of the Global Alliance for Banking and Values, because they really are there primarily for the mission, for helping those kind of organizations. Of course, it still has to be bankable, but I think they think totally different, and they advise these types of businesses really at eye level and with an understanding of what the situation is.
Leila, just on that larger point about global cooperation, do you see it because of the necessity for it now on some very basic issues? Do you see that as an opportunity for it to expand?
I'm hopeful that it would expand, because simply there are issues that have to be addressed across borders, and we're in a downturn right now, as we all know, in terms of global cooperation and multilateral support. These are very difficult years where countries are turning inwards, where there is a lot of protectionism, where free trade is rolling back. Some of the things that were in place, some of the gains that we had made are rolling back right now. So it is a very difficult moment, but it's also very clear that that these things go in cycle, and the benefits are so obvious. To have standards, public standards that can be applied universally across borders, or policies that require the participation of all nations. And I was very active in the participation of the business sector during the agreement for the Paris, the Paris Accords on climate change. And there's no doubt that the bilateral agreement that was signed between China and the US outside of the international negotiations prior to the negotiations in Paris were enormously helpful in getting the rest of the countries to agree on one common framework. And on the other side, there's no doubt that the business community, in their support and engagement for favorable climate policies, also enormously helped in getting governments the confidence that they need to commit to such a framework. So I think this is probably the last time that we saw all the nations of the world come together under one common framework. The same year, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by 193 nations at the UN, and after that, in the past 5 years, there's been a decline, unfortunately, in global cooperation. And I see it as a cycle of, showing us the worst effect of going for protectionism, getting to that rock bottom until we bounce back. And hopefully there's more wisdom and more political will put behind the need for global collaboration and multilateral action.
And the flip side of that is in a pandemic where obviously global cooperation is necessary on so many issues. We're also seeing, because of the other things we discussed, the need for self-sufficiency. We're seeing countries, America first, Canada first, whatever it may be, putting the emphasis on that and saying we need to deal with our domestic scene first, and that global international stuff maybe at another time and place. Josh, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think Leela's right too. That things move in cycles. That said, we've seen so many we've seen so many populations though around the world vote in governments that are more focused on the nation first, as opposed to the global world first. And I think what we have to do with that, like anything, is ask ourselves why, and what were we maybe doing not well enough in the past that has led to a majority of the population thinking that way at this point in time, and what can we do better as a result of going forward. And I think anytime you're in that time of turmoil, perhaps that's the biggest opportunity. I think, with COVID-19 also, as we come out of it, asking ourselves, what did we learn through the pandemic? And Senator, you point to, there has been, in some cases, wonderful collaboration around the world around bringing a vaccine to bear much faster than would typically be the case. And then on the other hand, you see governments, viciously negotiating to get the most vaccine they can for their own country, which is all understandable. But to me, the bottom line is, how do we ask ourselves how we can do better as we go forward, and whether that's better answering some of the cries of the public in our own country, or better putting a step forward when it comes to globalization and how we go about globalization. I think those are the tough questions we need to ask ourselves going forward.
Can we just come back for a moment, and I'd like to hear from all of you on this, because it's a question about leadership, and obviously at this time we need exceptional leadership because it's more difficult than we've ever seen. Where does it come from? I know, Martin, you said, younger generation taking over in the leadership ranks in corporations. Leela, more on, global cooperation. Josh, you've just touched on this question. Can we just, and I'll go to you first, Martin, just on the question of leadership. What does it mean in this era, and where are we going to get it today or tomorrow morning?
I think Josh touched upon it. I think there's leadership has to happen at very different levels. It has to happen at the level of government, of corporations, and we can't just point to other groups, but every sector has to be in charge. Where does leadership come from? I think leadership is about people, it's about personalities, and if I think about the younger generation that's maturing now, they have, I think they're extremely aware. We've, just to remind you, we've had, I don't know how strong this has been in North America, but here in Europe, we've had the youth climate movement last year, for example. So you had a whole generation who obviously has profoundly experienced this conversation around the risks and the challenges of climate change, and they've been growing up. And I think these are probably our best hope, because not only are they the ones probably that have most to gain by changing the direction in which the economy is going and our societies are developing, but they also really have embodied this change from a very young age onward. So I think that's where the leadership is probably going to come.
And the demand, I just want to stay with Martin for a moment, just the kind of technologies we see. I mean, things like blockchain might just democratize that process even further.
Well, I'm a little bit on the fence on that because I think there
Good, I'm
are.
glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, there are some risks around the technology and the digitalization of our world, and Josh mentioned it. If I look at the banking sector again, for example, I don't think the banking sector is going to look the same in 15 to 20 years from now anymore. Most likely, it's going to be a very virtual service. The young generation, they do not want to go into a bank. They want to deal with everything on their phones. So I think it's going to be a convergence of technology and of a new generation. And again, we're probably accelerating that tremendously through this crisis as we or even the older generation, even myself, I have to get used to this virtual technology, which I probably was a bit more reluctant maybe just 1 year ago, but apparently it works. So I think that's probably what will happen. It's this new generation that will probably also come much more quickly into these positions where they can actually drive this change. But I'm a bit concerned about the social impact of the digital revolution as we will be seeing it.
I want to come back to that question of leadership that we started on, but Josh, I want to hear from you on the points that Martin has just raised. I mean, there are lots of downsides to the technology, not just some of us who may be less familiar with it, but it leaves us way more vulnerable to hacking and money laundering and the corruption. It's really hard to maintain this when it's operating at such a massive level.
Yeah, I agree. And I think technology advancement gone after in an unbridled way is a recipe for some very difficult, very dangerous outcomes. And I think it's easy for that to be how we approach things. And you see how much new technology breakthroughs are lauded and celebrated, and the rise of new companies, we call them unicorns because of new technologies, is something to be heralded. And my perspective is it's got to be a combination, yes, of technology advancement, but also human ingenuity and human compassion. And how are we leveraging technology, injecting humanity into it to solve humanity's challenges, as opposed to just achieve something neat and new. And I think that gets back to Martin's point that leadership's got to come from everywhere, because and part of what you were saying earlier, Senator, to the extent we don't change the norms of the companies that are celebrated are just the ones that post the largest profit and the largest growth in profit, but more to Leela's point, the companies that post a balance of advanced goals. We are in danger of the unbridled technology advancement, but I'm hopeful, like Martin, that with new generations and with existing generations embracing new mindsets, and that's part of what I think 2020 has offered us all, is the chance to embrace new mindsets. I'm hopeful that it will be that combination of human ingenuity and technology advancement.
Leila, back to you on the question of leadership with the comments of your fellow panelists there.
Yeah, and I agree with Martin and Josh on the assessment that it needs to come from multiple sources, particularly in light of the big gaps that we're facing. I would put a big emphasis on citizens. I think not only as consumers, but also as citizens, making very clear what the preferences are, voting preferences, or all the marches that we've seen and the demonstrations and all of that. I think there's going to be a lot of influence on the side of citizens. And then in terms of the dynamic between corporations and government, there can be a virtuous cycle also of progressive companies pushing for progressive policies and therefore providing incentives to those same progressive companies and increasing the pool there. Something that we call the ambition loop, and a term that we coined looking at green technologies and those companies pushing for greater regulation in that sense. So thank you. I think we're and yeah.
No, we are running out of time, and I just wanted to thank you all for these very insightful comments. I wanted to just say that we have a new governor of the Bank of Canada, and he just said the other day, and I thought it's really important for everyone to hear, striving for equality of opportunity is simply the right thing to do. It's also good for growth. Uneven outcomes for some can lead to poor outcomes for all. And I think it's very good guiding advice. I also this morning just looked up the word resilience, because that was sort of at the core of what we were talking today. It meant originally the act of rebounding, of course, from the Latin word. It a little bit later on came to mean either recoil or rebound. So I think we have heard today that it's time for us to start springing back, for our economies to start working again. And it's just been a pleasure to hear what the leaders are saying. And the three of you are truly that. So I'm going to turn things back. I know there's some final comments coming and from Adele. So I'll just end it here and thank everybody for their participation. It's been terrific.
Thank you very much, Senator. I should confess that this webinar resonates a lot with my professional work and my personal kind of interest. I'm working on redefining the notion of value and value chains and value creation. And the corollary to that is we have to rethink how we configure the configuration of our global supply chains in response to all of this. And I think this is really great. J'ai l'honneur de partager avec vous la few announcements before I let you go. So, merci beaucoup pour les panélistes. C'était une excellente discussion sur le futur de gestion des affaires et puis bancaire. Je suis très honoré et privilégié de remercier Senator Wallin, Lila Karbasi, Martin Rohner, and Josh Blair for their outstanding comments throughout this webinar. And also recognizing the leadership of Dean Saul Klein and Dean Jim DeWalt for putting together this very exciting webinar. I am Adel Gitounia. I am the Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum. I'm responsible for working with the co-chairs putting together this program of webinars. This one, we were also privileged to work with two very important partners. So the University of Calgary Haskeen School of Business and the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. And throughout these webinars, we're extending the network of partners who are really engaged in the type of questions and issues that are addressed by the Victoria Forum. We have for you a number of webinars coming, so 3 before the end of the year. So the 2 coming. On October 1st, we will continue this conversation of bridging the public and private investment for resilient economies and inclusive recoveries. Et en octobre, le 15 octobre, on va parler de pour combler les clivages entre les sexes. Et ça, c'est une excellente opportunité pour pouvoir aussi avancer les disparités entre les sexes à travers le monde. Please book your calendar, and I hope our panelists and the participants will join us in the virtual Victoria Forum. We will actually have a roundtable discussion to be able to develop and design recommendations and solutions for the private sector, for the public sector, and for the civil society. And these series of webinars and the Virtual Victoria Forum and the activities that we are planning for 2021 are the result of a unique partnership between the University of Victoria and the Senate of Canada. And we recognize, and we are proud to recognize our founding partners, TELUS and Vancity. To the next webinar, I hope you will join us and continue engaged in the conversation. Thank you, everyone.